Hey folks, tonight we're diving into the lives of medieval peasants, some of the most resilient and resourceful people in history. These everyday heroes, facing incredible odds, managed to survive some of the coldest, harshest nights known to humankind. We'll explore everything from makeshift insulation to communal sleeping strategies, how they dealt with frigid nights when survival was the only goal. Before we get started, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. And, hey, drop a comment below to let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you're at. I always find it fascinating to see how far and wide these videos reach. Now, let's set the scene. When you picture medieval life, the image of knights in shining armor, grand feasts, and royal festivities might come to mind. But for the average peasant, winter wasn't about feasts or fun. It was about how to survive another night. The cold was relentless, and the homes they lived in barely offered any protection. These were more like rudimentary huts than real shelters, with walls so thin you could hear the wind whistling through them. And forget about insulation or proper heating. If the outside temperature dropped, so did the inside. Imagine this: you're living in a small, Madon-stick hut with walls that barely keep the wind at bay. No insulation, just a hole covered by some animal skin for a window, and no thermostat to keep you cozy. The fire in the hearth might keep one side of the room warm, but you're fighting the cold on every front. The best you could do was layer up and hope for the best. What about clothing? Well, you weren't wearing a fancy fur coat or heated boots. Peasants had a couple of wool tunics, maybe a cloak, and a few layers of rags wrapped around them, and sleeping. Well, beds were nothing more than sacks filled with straw or hay. It's as if they were trying to turn themselves into living, breathing beds of straw without much success. Still, these harsh conditions weren't just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and even death were real threats. In fact, waking up alive in the morning after a cold night was considered a small victory. Now, nights were the worst. The air was so cold you could practically feel your breath freeze in the air. The wind howled, and that fire in the hearth barely did enough to keep you warm. People weren't cuddling up under down comforters either. They were layering up with whatever they could find, including wool tunics and cloaks that smelled like their sheep. These garments didn't do much to keep out the cold, but they were all the peasants had. Beds, forget about it. No comfy mattress or soft blankets to keep you cozy. They were lucky if they had a pile of straw on the floor. And when it wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. One of the biggest risks, the ground beneath them. It wasn't a wooden floor or a comfy mattress, it was dirt. And when the rains came, that dirt turned into mud that soaked through everything, making every step feel like walking on a frozen marsh. And when you dropped something, it became part of the permafrost. In the fight against the cold, peasants got creative. They packed every gap in the walls with moss, rags, and anything that would help block the wind. The real secret weapon: body heat. Entire families would huddle together in the same room, close to the fire, and try to keep each other warm. They didn't have modern insulation or fancy heaters. They had each other. But it wasn't just the cold from outside that they had to worry about. Medieval homes were drafty, to say the least. Imagine living in a house that was essentially a wind tunnel. The wind wasn't just blowing through cracks, it was howling through every opening, making the inside of the house feel like the outside. And it wasn't just the air that was a problem. The roofs were thatched, and while they looked pretty, they didn't hold up against rain or snow. Peasants would have to patch them up with cloth, grass, or even turf from nearby fields. And if you were lucky enough to have windows, well, those tiny holes were covered with animal hides, glass. That was a luxury no one could afford, only the rich could dream of that. For peasants, the focus was survival, keeping out the cold, stopping the wind, and trying not to freeze to death was their main job during the winter months. They didn't have much, but they had ingenuity. They packed gaps with whatever they could find, and they did their best to stay alive. Stay tuned as we get deeper into the day-to-day strategies. They used to survive the freezing temperatures and how they turned these extreme challenges into everyday resilience. So, let's dive deeper into the daily survival tactics medieval peasants had to use to make it through the harsh winters. They didn't have modern conveniences like heaters, double-glazed windows, or fluffy comforters. Instead, they had to get creative with what they had, and what they had was a mix of stubbornness, resourcefulness, and a deep understanding of how to work with nature, not against it. Let's talk about sleeping arrangements. As I mentioned earlier, there were no cozy beds to crawl into after a long, cold day. What did they sleep on? A lot of times, it was just a pile of straw on the floor, possibly sprinkled with herbs for a bit of comfort and smell. But here's the thing, those straw beds, they weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. The straw would flatten over time, grow moldy, and attract pests. Imagine trying to sleep while scratching at fleas and lice all night. Sounds fun, right? But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the cold that seeped up from the ground, creeping into your body while you tried to sleep. You couldn't escape it. The floor was just dirt, and that dirt was often colder than the freezing air outside. The heating strategy, well, let's be clear, it wasn't about central heating or high-tech solutions. It was about the hearth. The hearth was the heart of the home, quite literally. If the hearth went out, you could kiss your warmth goodbye. Most homes didn't have fireplaces with chimneys. Instead, the fire burned in a small pit right in the middle of the room. It was the only defense against the cold. And because there was no thermostat, no way to control the temperature, it was all about making the fire last through the night. But the fire wasn't just for warmth. It was also used for cooking and as a light source. Keeping the fire alive was essential for survival. If the fire went out in the middle of the night, it wasn't just inconvenient, it was a serious threat to your life. They didn't have matches or lighters. If the fire died, it had to be rekindled using flint, steel, and kindling, which wasn't easy in the freezing cold. So, peasants came up with a clever solution: firebanking. Firebanking meant covering the embers with ash before bed. The ash would insulate the fire, keeping it just hot enough to light again in the morning. But getting it right was tricky. If you didn't bank the fire well enough, you'd wake up to a cold, dark house. But if you did it right, you'd have fire to start your day, just one more victory in the war against winter. Sleeping arrangements were no better. Peasants didn't get a quiet, restful night's sleep. No, sleep was a game of survival. Whole families would huddle together in the same room, next to the fire, trying to keep warm. And when I say whole families, I mean everyone. Grandparents, parents, children, even livestock. You heard me right. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, and sometimes even horses would share the space, because they were warm and could help keep the temperature up. Sure, it wasn't exactly cozy, but in a home with walls full of drafts, there was no such thing as personal space. You did what you had to do to survive, and that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your family, your neighbors, and maybe even a very confused goose. You'd have to forget about privacy and comfort, because if you didn't stay close, you were risking frostbite. In fact, You could say that sleeping together was more than just a family bonding experience. It was a matter of life and death. As for clothing, well, the goal wasn't about fashion. It was about survival. Peasants didn't care about looking cute. They were just trying to stay alive. If you owned it, you wore it. And when it came to winter, that meant layering up as much as possible. You'd start with a rough linen shirt, then add a wool tunic, followed by a cloak, and if you were lucky, maybe a sheepskin on top. That was about as good as it got. There were no fancy fabrics or woolen sweaters, just scratchy layers of cloth that did their best to keep the cold out. Boots, not unless you were extremely lucky. Most peasants wrapped their feet in rags or old cloth and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still got through, well, you just added another rag or layer and hoped it was enough. And let's not even talk about washing. Washing your clothes in winter meant trudging through snow to a frozen river and then waiting days for your only shirt to dry. It wasn't worth the effort, so most peasants just let their clothes get dirtier and dirtier, and the dirt had a purpose. That layer of grime actually helped insulate them, keeping some of the warmth in it. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. And if you thought your modern winter gear was a pain, imagine trying to stay warm with just a few layers of itchy wool and a coat that smells like your sheep. Yeah, not fun. But, in a way, that dirt and grime was their version of winter-proofing, like a medieval version of a modern high-tech jacket, but much less glamorous. And while they might not have looked fashionable, they were doing what they could to survive. But the real heroes of survival weren't just the people in their homes. It was the animals. Animals weren't just companions. They were life-saving machines. In medieval times, keeping animals close wasn't a luxury, it was essential. Cows, goats, chickens, they all helped generate warmth, and in a time when warmth was in short supply, every little bit helped. Sure, there were the occasional downsides, like the smell, but the reality was that animals played a key role in helping peasants survive the freezing nights. And even if that meant sleeping with a goat at your feet, so be it. As long as that goat's warmth helped you make it through the night, it was worth it. This might sound rough, but medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of comfort or convenience. They didn't have heated homes, modern fabrics, or even a warm cup of tea before bed. What they had was each other, their animals, and a fierce will to survive. They made it through some of the harshest conditions imaginable because they adapted. They made do with what they had, and that made all the difference. And when the cold wasn't enough, there were still other battles to fight. The frozen ground itself was an enemy. The dirt floors weren't just uncomfortable, they were downright hostile. The cold seeped up from the earth, making every step feel like a reminder that winter wasn't just outside, it was everywhere. The straw and rushes they laid down weren't a perfect solution, but it was the best they had, and they had to keep adding fresh layers because the old ones would just get flattened, moldy, and covered in bugs. But that didn't stop them. They kept pushing through, layering up, and keeping close to their families, animals, and fires. So, how did these peasants survive winter? They did it by using every trick in the bookhand. Sometimes they had to make up their own. They knew the cold was coming, and they knew they had to fight back however they could. And when it came down to it, they didn't just survive, they thrived in their own stubborn way. Their ability to adapt, to make use of every scrap of fabric, straw, and animal, made them the true survivors of medieval winters. Now, we've covered the basics of how medieval peasants survived the harsh winters, but let's take a closer look at how they handled their homes and their lives in the face of such extreme conditions. The daily grind for peasants wasn't easy, And it wasn't just about getting through the cold. It was about managing every resource, whether that was food, firewood, or even the materials used to repair the house when the winter storms blew in. The skills they used were honed over generations, passed down from parent to child, each one learning what worked and what didn't. House construction was one of the first things that needed constant attention. Most medieval homes, particularly those of peasants, were made of what historians call wattle and daba construction technique that involved weaving branches together and covering them with mud, animal dung, and straw. This mixture, while inexpensive and readily available, wasn't exactly weatherproof. In fact, it was barely waterproof. This meant that when winter arrived, the cold drafts weren't just an inconvenience. They were constant, swirling through every crack in the walls, and every time it rained or snowed, the walls would absorb water, which made them even weaker. But here's the thing, the drafts weren't the only issue. The roofs were also problematic. Most peasant homes had thatched roofs made from straw or reeds. They looked charming in a rustic way, but they didn't hold up well during a heavy storm. The straw would sag, get soggy, and sometimes let in the rain or snow, turning the home into a giant leaky bucket. At night, the sounds of rain hitting the roof, mixed with the howling wind outside, must have been terrifying. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a matter of survival. If you didn't keep your roof intact, your whole home could collapse. Because these homes weren't built to last forever. Peasants would spend a portion of their time patching them up, sometimes using mud and animal dung to fill in cracks and holes. In some cases, they would even cover their homes with extra layers of mud to try and keep the cold at bay. Yes, mud. It was the perfect material to pack into the cracks to try to keep the elements from getting inside. But in many ways, mud was just a temporary fix. Rebuilding these homes was a constant job, and it was something peasants knew they would have to do every year. The cold, the rain, and the snow had a way of wearing down even the toughest shelters. And let's talk about flooring. For most peasants, the floor wasn't a smooth surface you could walk on without thinking twice. Instead, the floor was often packed with dirt or even just straw. During the winter months, when it rained or snowed heavily, the mud would seep up from the earth and make the floor slippery, mucky, and uncomfortable to walk on. Imagine trying to get through your day in a cold, dirty home with floors that turned to mud at the slightest touch. It wasn't exactly a comfortable existence, but this was their reality. And like everything else, they made do with what they had. Oh, what about light? It's not something we think about often, but for peasants in medieval times, light was just as crucial as warmth. With no electricity, no light bulbs, and no candles that burned for hours, they had to make use of the fire for warmth and light. During the long winter nights, when it got dark around 4 p.m., the hearth was often the only source of light. And let's be honest, a fire wasn't exactly the best way to light a room. Smoke from the fire would fill the room, making it hard to breathe, and if the chimney didn't vent properly, the smoke would just settle in the house. In some cases, peasants would even cover the walls with animal skins to try to keep the smoke out. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary for survival. Now, the question on everyone's mind is, how did they manage food? Well, food preservation was key during the winter months. Peasants didn't have the luxury of fresh fruit and vegetables year-round. They couldn't just run to the store and pick up a salad when they were craving something light. Instead, they had to rely on the food they grew and preserved. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and parsnips were staples of their winter diet because they could last through the cold months. These vegetables were hardy and able to withstand the frost. But let's face it, they didn't exactly have the most exciting diet. They ate whatever they could get, often stewing vegetables with whatever meat they could manage to scrounge up. The meat might be salted or dried to keep it from spoiling. Now, dried fish was a common food source in coastal regions. Salted or dried fish was an important staple, providing much-needed protein. The fish was typically dried out in the sun or smoked over the fire, allowing it to last through the cold winter months. Salt was another essential item for preservation, and it played a huge role in keeping meat from spoiling. Bread was also a key part of their diet, but it wasn't like the bread we eat today. Medieval bread was dense, hearty, and often coarse, not fluffy and light like the white bread you might find in the supermarket today. It was made with a mixture of grains, often rye or barley, and was about as far from a delicate loaf of sourdough as you could get. Bread could be stored for long periods, and peasants would often dip it in stews or use it to soak up the broth of a meal. But here's the thing, food wasn't always easy to come by. The winter months were tough, and sometimes the crops failed. Peasants were at the mercy of the weather, and if there wasn't enough rain during the growing season, or if an unexpected frost hit, food would be scarce. In times of scarcity, it wasn't unusual for peasants to turn to extreme measures. There are even stories of people resorting to eating dandelions, tree bark, and sometimes even eating each other in the most extreme cases. The fear of going hungry was always in the back of their minds, and it made their survival instincts even sharper. Peasants were used to rationing their food, making sure that every last scrap went to good use. They didn't waste anything. Even bones from meat were boiled to make broth or reused to make tools. Peasants weren't luxury eaters. Their meals were focused on survival and getting by. And in winter, their meals weren't just about feeding their bellies, they were about staying warm and keeping their bodies functioning through the brutal cold. And like the rest of their lives, food was about managing what little they had. Now that we've touched on some of the basics of survival, let's dive into the deeper aspects of life for medieval peasants during the harsh winter months. This wasn't just about fighting the cold or finding food. It was also about staying connected with the community and with nature. Life in medieval times wasn't easy, and when the cold months rolled in, peasants had to rely on each other more than ever to get through. One of the key elements of surviving winter was the communal aspect of peasant life. Family wasn't just a group of people you were related to, it was your team. It was the people you huddled together with to survive the cold, who worked beside you to keep the fire going, and who were there to watch over each other. Communities of peasants would band together for support, often in ways that went beyond just family. If someone's house was in need of repair, or if there was a shortage of food, neighbors would pitch in to help. It was a form of mutual aid that kept the community strong in the face of adversity. But this communal life wasn't just about helping one another. It was also about sharing resources. This is where things like the hearth and communal meals came into play. The hearth wasn't just a place to warm up. It was the center of a social network. People would gather around it, not just to stay warm, but to socialize and exchange information. This was also a place where people could share stories, discuss the events of the day, and even make decisions for the community. The fire in the hearth might have been the literal warmth they needed, but it was also the emotional warmth that brought people together. They would spend hours around the fire, talking about the past, sharing news from the outside world, and even telling stories. Storytelling was an essential part of peasant life because it was how knowledge and traditions were passed down from generation to generation. But it wasn't all cozy conversations. Winter meant that certain activities had to be put on hold. Agricultural work, for example, was limited in the colder months. So many peasants had to focus on other tasks like repairing tools, tending to livestock, and preparing food for the months ahead. It was also a time when peasants would make clothing and shelter repairs for the coming year. They'd mend worn-out garments, fix up their dilapidated homes, and gather firewood for the long, cold months ahead. Firewood was one of the most important resources a peasant could have. Without it, there was no warmth, and without warmth, survival was unlikely. Gathering firewood wasn't a simple task either. There were no lumber yards or stores to go to. It was up to the peasants themselves to cut wood from nearby forests, and the weather didn't make this task any easier. They had to work quickly before the snow covered the ground too heavily or the cold made the wood harder to cut. Cutting firewood was hard, physically demanding work, and it wasn't something you could put off until the next day. Every day, peasants would make sure to have enough wood stacked up to keep the fire burning. This wasn't just for warmth, it was for cooking, light, and social life. Without the fire, they were lost. Now, we've already mentioned livestock playing a role in keeping the peasants warm. But let's talk a bit more about how the animals were an integral part of the community. These animals were more than just food or work animals. In a sense, they were like extended family. In the dead of winter, they weren't just kept outside, they were brought into the house to sleep. This was a survival tactic. The animals generated heat, and in homes that were already drafty, that heat was precious. Peasants didn't have barns to keep their animals in. The animals shared the living space with the family. So, cows, goats, pigs, and chickens often slept inside. It wasn't pretty. There was the smell, the noise, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, but the animals kept the house warmer. In many ways, they were life-saving, and there were even more practical reasons for keeping animals close. Livestock was a huge investment. If a cow or a pig was kept outside in freezing temperatures, there was a chance it could freeze to death or be stolen by a neighbor. But if they were kept inside, not only did they provide warmth, but they were also safer. In addition to the animals, peasants also had to make sure they had enough food stores to survive the winter. Preserving food for the cold months wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Peasants relied heavily on preserved foods, salted meats, dried fish, root vegetables, and grains like barley, oats, and rye. They also preserved fruits and vegetables by pickling or drying them, ensuring they had enough to eat when fresh produce wasn't available. The problem was that, even with all this food preservation, there was still a chance that supplies might run out. So, sharing food with neighbors, pooling resources, and trading became even more critical during the winter months. But here's the kicker. The cold wasn't the only challenge medieval peasants faced. While surviving the winter was a battle in itself, there were other threats like disease, pestilence, and even the risk of fire. These dangers lurked just as much as the cold. The damp, dark winter months created the perfect breeding ground for disease. Flu, pneumonia, and other illnesses would spread through the village, weakening the community. And if the fire in the hearth got out of control, the entire house could go up in flames in minutes. But despite all this, peasants had one thing going for them: community. They banded together to survive the cold, diseases, and even the occasional fire, and somehow they made it work. In the face of all this hardship, hope was something that kept them going. And even if it was just a flicker in the distance, the hope of spring was always there, ready to break through the endless winter. Spring was the promise of new life, new crops, and fresh food. It was the light at the end of the tunnel, and no matter how cold and dark the winter seemed, the peasants knew that one day the snow would melt, the flowers would bloom, and life would go on. As we near the end of our journey through the winters of medieval peasants, it's clear that resilience was the key to their survival. It wasn't just about fighting the elements or holding on to hope. It was about adapting to the harshest conditions and making do with what little they had. Their lives were a constant balancing act between endurance and resourcefulness. Every day brought a new challenge, from keeping the fire burning to finding enough food to stay alive. Yet they managed to survive the winter months in ways that were nothing short of remarkable. One of the most striking things about medieval peasants was their mental toughness. The cold was relentless, the days were short, and the nights felt endless, but the peasants didn't have the luxury of despair. They knew that complaining wouldn't change anything, and they had learned to embrace the idea of making the best of things. If the house had holes in the walls, they stuffed them with whatever they could find: moss, rags, or animal hair. If the fire wasn't keeping the room warm, they piled on more layers of clothing, wrapped themselves in woolen cloaks, and huddled closer together. Every small victory, like keeping the fire alive or waking up with your fingers still attached, was celebrated because it meant you were still in the fight. But resilience wasn't just about surviving the cold or getting through another day. It was about community. Throughout the cold months, peasants didn't just survive together, they thrived together, finding ways to share resources, help one another, and keep each other's spirits up. Whether it was lending a hand with building repairs, gathering firewood, or simply keeping each other company during long, cold nights, solidarity was key. Families and neighbors came together, not just to survive the winter, but to stay connected, stay strong, and stay human. Peasants also had a strong spiritual connection to the world around them. Faith wasn't just an afterthought, it was woven into their daily lives. When winter arrived, they prayed for warmth, for the health of their families, and for a successful harvest come spring. The fire, the hearth, and even the food they ate were seen as gifts from a higher power. And during the harshest moments, when the cold seemed unbearable and the days stretched on forever, it was that faith that helped them hold on just a little longer. Prayer was a way to feel that they weren't facing these challenges alone, that there was something bigger than the winter, and that spring would eventually come. The peasants also had their own rituals to keep them going. During winter, they would often gather for celebrations like winter solstice festivals or feasts to mark important dates on the agricultural calendar. While these were not the grand feasts of kings and queens, they were moments of joy and community that provided a much-needed break from the struggles of survival. Sharing a simple meal, lighting candles to push back the darkness, or singing together around the fire was a way of reminding themselves that life wasn't just about survival, it was about living and finding joy in the little things, even during the coldest times. But these moments of celebration were fleeting. Winter always returned, bringing its own set of trials and hardships. And when the snow finally began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared on the horizon, it was hope that kept the peasants pushing through. They looked forward to the thawing of the ground, the return of greenery, and the ability to start planting crops once again. Spring wasn't just a season, it was the promise of renewal and the reward for surviving another grueling winter. The melting snow signaled the end of one battle and the beginning of a new cycle. This cycle of life, death, and rebirth was a constant rhythm in the lives of medieval peasants. It wasn't always easy, and it certainly wasn't glamorous, but there was a certain beauty in how they adapted, resisted, and survived. through ingenuity, hard work, and deep community bonds. They not only managed to survive some of the coldest and most brutal winters in history, they thrived. As we reflect on their lives, we can draw a parallel to our own. Today, we might not have to worry about surviving winter in the same way that medieval peasants did, but we still face challenges. Whether it's a personal struggle, a global crisis, or just the day-to-day grind. There are moments when we all feel like we're fighting against the elements. And when we face those moments, maybe we can remember the medieval peasants, their resilience, their determination, and their unwavering belief that they could make it through anything. They didn't just survive the winter, they lived it. They turned each challenge into an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to connect with those around them. In a world that often feels cold and uncertain, maybe there's something to be learned from their way of life. Resilience, community, adaptation, and hope. These are the things that keep us going when everything else seems to be falling apart. So, the next time you feel the cold winds or the weight of the world on your shoulders, think of those medieval peasants. They didn't have all the luxuries we do today, but they had something even more powerful, the strength to face every winter with hope in their hearts and determination in their bones. And maybe that's what it takes to make it through the hardest of times. Thanks for watching, and remember, survival is more than just getting by. It's about learning to thrive, no matter how cold the world gets.